Every civilization that has ever existed has produced love stories. Stories of passion and sacrifice and devotion that outlasted the people who lived them. But in all of recorded human history, across every culture and every century, there is one love story that stands apart from every other. Not because it was the most romantic, not because it was the most pure, but because of what it cost. Two people fell in love in the 1st century BC, and that love story toppled kingdoms, ended a dynasty 3 centuries old, triggered a war that killed hundreds of thousands, and permanently transformed the greatest empire on earth. Their names were Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And this is how their love destroyed the ancient world. Before we talk about the love story, we need to understand the world it happened in. Because Mark Antony and Cleopatra did not fall in love in peaceful times. They fell in love in the middle of the most dangerous political moment the ancient world had ever produced. Julius Caesar had just been assassinated on the Ides of March 44 BC. The Roman Republic, which had governed the Mediterranean world for 5 centuries, was tearing itself apart in civil war. Every powerful person alive was calculating their next move, choosing sides, trying to survive in a world where the rules had suddenly stopped applying. Into that chaos stepped two of the most extraordinary individuals the ancient world ever produced. And their meeting would change everything. Mark Antony is one of the most misunderstood figures in ancient history. Shakespeare made him the grieving, loyal friend of Caesar. Hollywood made him the passionate lover who abandoned everything for a woman. But the real Mark Antony was something far more complicated and far more impressive than either portrait suggests. He was born around 83 BC into a family with genuine Roman aristocratic credentials, but chronically unstable finances. His father died young. His stepfather was executed. His early life was marked by exactly the kind of instability that either breaks people or forges them into something extraordinary. In Antony's case, it forged him into the most physically imposing, personally charismatic, and militarily gifted Roman commander of his generation. Antony's physical presence was genuinely remarkable even by ancient standards. Ancient sources describe him as resembling the god Hercules in appearance, broad, powerful, with a thick neck and a bearing that commanded attention in any room he entered. He wore his beard in a style deliberately evoking Hercules, the ancestor his family claimed descent from. He was not pretending to be something he was not. He genuinely looked the part, and beyond the physical presence was a personal magnetism that ancient sources struggle to fully explain but consistently describe. Men followed him with genuine devotion. Soldiers who had served under other commanders requested transfer to his forces. He inspired loyalty not through fear or calculation, but through something more instinctive and more powerful. His relationship with Julius Caesar defined the first half of his career. Antony served under Caesar in Gaul and proved himself a genuinely exceptional military officer, brave to the point of recklessness, brilliant at the kind of fast-moving, aggressive tactics Caesar favored, and capable of inspiring his men to extraordinary efforts through sheer personal example. Caesar recognized what he had and advanced Antony rapidly. By the time of Caesar's assassination, Antony was serving as co-consul, the second highest position in the Roman government. He was Caesar's right hand, his enforcer, his most trusted military commander. When the daggers came out on the Ides of March, Antony was the most powerful Roman alive after Caesar, and he was also the most dangerous. What Antony did in the immediate aftermath of Caesar's assassination is one of the greatest displays of political intelligence in ancient history. He did not panic. He did not immediately raise armies or call for vengeance. He negotiated. He met with the conspirators and reached an agreement: amnesty for the assassins in exchange for the right to give Caesar a public funeral. The conspirators, particularly Brutus, agreed, thinking this was a reasonable compromise. It was the worst decision they ever made, because Antony's funeral speech for Caesar was not mourning. It was a weapon. By the time he finished speaking over Caesar's body in the Roman Forum, the city was rioting and the conspirators were running for their lives. But here is where Antony's story gets complicated in a way that most histories skip entirely. Because just when he seemed positioned to take Caesar's place as the dominant force in Rome, a teenager appeared and disrupted everything. Caesar's adopted son and heir, Octavian, arrived in Rome at 18 years old claiming his inheritance and his political legacy. Antony dismissed him completely. He was a boy. He was physically unimpressive, slight, frequently ill, with none of Antony's battlefield reputation or personal magnetism. Antony made the same mistake everyone would make about Octavian for the next decade. He underestimated him, and that underestimation would eventually cost Antony everything. But that ending was still years away. First there was Egypt. First there was Cleopatra. Everything you think you know about Cleopatra is probably wrong. The image that has dominated Western culture for 2,000 years, the exotic beauty using her appearance to manipulate powerful men, is almost entirely an invention of her enemies, particularly the Roman propaganda machine that Augustus Caesar deployed against her during the final war. The real Cleopatra was something far more impressive and far more threatening than a seductress. She was the most politically intelligent ruler of her era. She was the first member of her dynasty, the Ptolemies, who had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, to actually bother learning the Egyptian language. Her predecessors had ruled Egypt for generations while speaking only Greek and treating Egyptians as subjects rather than people. Cleopatra spoke 9 languages including Egyptian, Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic, and several others. She studied philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Ancient sources describe her conversation as her most powerful tool, not her appearance, but her mind, her wit, her ability to make whoever she was speaking with feel that she was the most interested and interesting person in the world. The Roman historian Plutarch, writing about her a century after her death, said that the charm of her presence was irresistible and that there was an attraction in her person and her conversation that stimulated everyone who met her. He specifically noted that her beauty was not incomparable by itself. It was everything together that made her extraordinary. She became Queen of Egypt at 18 years old after her father died, initially ruling jointly with her younger brother Ptolemy, 13, as Egyptian royal tradition required. The joint rule collapsed almost immediately into civil war between their factions. Cleopatra was driven out of Alexandria by her brother's advisors and was essentially a refugee queen commanding a small army on Egypt's border when Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC pursuing his defeated rival Pompey. What happened next is one of history's most famous meetings. Cleopatra needed to speak to Caesar without being intercepted by her brother's forces who controlled the city. According to ancient sources, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters rolled inside a bundle of carpet or bedding. She emerged in front of the most powerful man alive and proceeded to charm him completely. Caesar was 52. Cleopatra was 21. Their relationship produced a son, Caesarion, and a political alliance that restored Cleopatra to her throne and eliminated her brother as a rival. Caesar spent nearly a year in Egypt, far longer than any military or political necessity required, and what ancient sources make clear was genuine personal attachment rather than purely political calculation. When he finally left for Rome, he left 3 legions behind to protect Cleopatra's position. She later followed him to Rome and was living there, openly acknowledged, when Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC. She fled back to Egypt immediately. Caesar was gone. Her protector, her ally, the father of her son was dead, and Egypt's future had never been more uncertain. 41 BC, 3 years after Caesar's death. The Roman world has been divided between 3 men: Octavian controlling the western provinces, Antony controlling the eastern Mediterranean, and a third man named Lepidus holding North Africa in an increasingly marginalized role. Antony is in the east consolidating his territory and preparing for a massive campaign against Parthia, the Persian successor empire that had humiliated Rome a decade earlier. He needs money. He needs ships. He needs supplies. He sends a summons to Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, ordering her to appear before him and answer accusations that she had supported his enemies during the recent civil wars. Cleopatra receives the summons, and she decides exactly how she is going to respond. She did not arrive like a summoned subject. She arrived like a goddess. Ancient sources, particularly Plutarch, describe her arrival at Tarsus in what is now southern Turkey in terms that read almost like theater criticism rather than historical record. Her barge had a golden stern, purple sails, and silver oars that dipped in time to the music of flutes and harps playing on deck. She reclined under a canopy of gold cloth dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love, fanned by boys dressed as cupids. Her attendants were dressed as sea nymphs. The smell of burning perfumes drifted across the water to the shore before the barge even arrived. The entire city of Tarsus apparently emptied to watch her come in. Antony was left sitting essentially alone on his tribunal as the crowds abandoned him for the waterfront. Antony sent an invitation for Cleopatra to dine with him. She sent a counter-invitation. He should come dine with her instead. And he accepted. What happened at that dinner has been described by ancient sources in extraordinary detail. The lighting, the food, the number of couches, the quality of the vessels, the roses spread a foot deep across the floor. Whether every detail is accurate is impossible to verify. What is certain is the effect. Antony, the most worldly and experienced Roman commander alive, a man who had seen the greatest city in the world and the courts of Eastern kings, was completely overwhelmed. He stayed in Tarsus. Then he followed her to Alexandria, and the campaign against Parthia that he had been planning for months was quietly forgotten. What followed in Alexandria during the winter of 41 to 40 BC was one of the most famous episodes of indulgence in ancient history. Ancient sources describe a society Antony and Cleopatra formed called the Inimitable Livers, a group dedicated to elaborate daily competitions in pleasure, feasting, drinking, and entertainment. They wandered the streets of Alexandria at night in disguise. They held banquets where the extravagance was deliberately escalated each evening. They competed in fishing, in hunting, in games. For Antony, who had spent years on campaigns sleeping rough and eating soldiers' rations, Alexandria was an almost incomprehensible sensory experience. But underneath the pleasure there was something more serious developing. These were two extraordinarily intelligent people who had found in each other something they had not found anywhere else. But Rome did not disappear while Antony was in Alexandria. The political situation that had been simmering since Caesar's death was developing in ways that demanded his attention. His wife Fulvia and his brother had actually launched a military uprising against Octavian in Italy while Antony was with Cleopatra, an uprising that failed catastrophically and forced Antony to finally leave Egypt and deal with the consequences. The crisis was eventually resolved through negotiation and temporarily papered over with a peace treaty sealed in the most Roman way possible. Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia, a woman described by ancient sources as exceptionally intelligent, dignified, and genuinely admirable in every way. It was a purely political marriage, but it was a real marriage, and Cleopatra was not in it. For several years Antony remained in the Western Roman world, working with Octavian, managing his marriage to Octavia, functioning as a Roman statesman rather than an Eastern king. He was doing what Romans expected of him. He was behaving as his role required. But the pull of the East was constant. The Parthian campaign that he had been planning since before he met Cleopatra still needed to happen. It was both a military necessity and a path to the kind of glory that could match Caesar's conquest of Gaul. And the East meant Egypt. Egypt meant Cleopatra. When he finally launched his Parthian campaign, and it went badly enough to be considered one of the significant Roman military failures of the era, he went to Alexandria to recover. And he did not leave again. By 37 BC, Antony had made his choice in a way that could no longer be explained away or politically managed. He sent Octavia back to Rome, a profound public humiliation for her and a direct personal insult to her brother Octavian that could not be forgiven or forgotten. He returned to Cleopatra formally and publicly. He acknowledged the twins she had borne him during his absence, a boy and a girl, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. And then in 34 BC, he performed a ceremony in Alexandria that Romans found either deeply alarming or deeply offensive, depending on their political position. He sat on a golden throne beside Cleopatra and distributed Roman territories to her and their children as if he were an Eastern king disposing of his kingdom. This ceremony, known as the Donations of Alexandria, was the moment the political conflict between Antony and Octavian became inevitable and irreversible. Antony had given Cleopatra Cyprus, Crete, and significant portions of the Middle East. He had named Caesarion, Caesar's son by Cleopatra, as the legitimate heir of Julius Caesar, directly challenging Octavian's entire claim to power, which rested on being Caesar's adopted heir. He had declared his own children by Cleopatra rulers of territories that Rome considered Roman. From Octavian's perspective, and from the perspective of most Romans watching events unfold, Antony had stopped being Roman. He had become something else, something Eastern, something that Rome's entire cultural identity was built in opposition to. And Octavian moved immediately to exploit that perception. Octavian was a political genius of a completely different kind than either Antony or Cleopatra. Where Antony was physical and emotional and instinctive, Octavian was cold, patient, systematic, and utterly ruthless in pursuit of long-term goals. He had spent years building institutions, cultivating public opinion, managing his image with extraordinary care. Now he deployed all of that preparation against Antony with devastating precision. He did not declare war on Antony directly. That would have made it look like another Roman civil war, which Romans were exhausted by. Instead, he declared war specifically on Cleopatra. He framed the entire conflict as Rome defending itself against a foreign queen who had seduced a Roman commander and turned him against his own people. It was propaganda. It was brilliant. And it worked completely. The war culminated at the Battle of Actium on September 2, 31 BC, a naval engagement off the western coast of Greece that determined the future of the entire Mediterranean world. Antony and Cleopatra had assembled a formidable combined force, several hundred warships, and significant land forces. Octavian's Admiral Agrippa, arguably the finest naval commander Rome ever produced, had blockaded their fleet in the Gulf of Ambracia for weeks, cutting off supplies and allowing disease to reduce Antony's forces before the battle even began. When the engagement finally happened, it was already compromised before the first oar struck water. Antony's crews were weakened, his ships undermanned, his strategic position deteriorating daily. And then something happened that changed everything instantly. Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships, which had been positioned at the rear of the formation, broke through the battle line and sailed away south toward Egypt. Why she left has been debated for 2,000 years. Was it a prearranged plan to preserve the treasury and the fleet for a fighting retreat to Egypt where they could continue the war? Was it panic? Was it a signal that she believed the battle was already lost and survival mattered more than victory? Ancient sources disagree completely, and no consensus has ever been reached. What is not disputed is what happened next. Antony, upon seeing Cleopatra's fleet departing, left his own flagship, transferred to a smaller vessel, and followed her. He abandoned his fleet in the middle of battle, and the fleet, without its commander, surrendered. Ancient sources describe what happened when Antony caught up with Cleopatra's fleet as one of the most psychologically devastating portraits of a man in crisis in all of ancient literature. He did not go to her immediately. He sat alone at the prow of the ship for 3 days, head in his hands, speaking to no one, eating nothing. 3 days of complete psychological collapse in a man who had been one of the most dynamic and physically vital human beings of his age. Whatever calculations or plans or hopes had sustained him through years of political conflict with Octavian, through the failures of the Parthian campaign, through the accusations and propaganda, all of it collapsed at Actium. He had left his men to follow a woman, and the woman had left first. They reached Egypt. They tried to rebuild. They sent diplomatic messages to Octavian exploring terms, Cleopatra asking to be allowed to pass her kingdom to her children, Antony asking to be allowed to live privately in Egypt or Athens as a private citizen. Octavian's responses were carefully calibrated to divide them, encouraging Cleopatra to think a separate arrangement might be possible while giving Antony nothing. Whether Cleopatra seriously considered betraying Antony to save herself and her children is something historians still debate. What is clear is that Octavian had no intention of allowing either of them to survive in any meaningful sense. He needed them both gone. The last connection to the old world, to Caesar, to the Republic, to everything that preceded his own power, it all had to end. When Octavian's forces entered Egypt in 30 BC, Antony's remaining troops melted away or defected almost immediately. He received a false report that Cleopatra was dead. Some ancient sources suggest this message was deliberately sent by Cleopatra herself, though the reasons and truth of this are deeply unclear. Upon hearing she was dead, Antony fell on his own sword. He did not die immediately. He lay wounded when messengers arrived telling him Cleopatra was actually alive, in her mausoleum, and asking for him. He was carried to her. She would not open the doors for fear of Octavian's soldiers, so she and her attendants hauled him up through a window using ropes. He died in her arms. Ancient sources say she was covered in blood and would not let go of his body. Cleopatra survived Antony by a matter of days. Octavian came to see her personally. She was still a queen in bearing, even in defeat, still attempting to negotiate, still using every tool available to her extraordinary mind. He was polite. He was unmoved. She understood that he intended to take her to Rome as a trophy in his triumph, to parade her through the streets in chains as the foreign temptress who had corrupted Rome's greatest general. She had watched what happened to defeated enemies in Roman triumphs. She had no intention of providing that spectacle. She died by her own hand, by poison, on August 12, 30 BC. She was 39 years old. With her death, the 300-year Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt ended, and Rome became the world. Octavian walked into Alexandria as the master of the entire Mediterranean world. Every rival was gone. Antony dead. Cleopatra dead. Caesarion, Caesar's son by Cleopatra and the one person whose existence could theoretically challenge Octavian's claim as Caesar's heir, was hunted down and executed within days. Octavian was 23 years old, and he owned the world. He would rule it for the next 44 years as Rome's first emperor, Augustus Caesar, the most powerful individual in Western history to that point. The love story of Antony and Cleopatra had cleared the board completely and handed absolute power to the one person neither of them had taken seriously enough. The cold, calculating teenager who had waited patiently while passion and ambition destroyed everyone around him. So what do we make of this story 2,000 years later? Was it really a love story? Or was it a political alliance that both parties dressed in the language of love because that framing served their purposes? The honest answer is probably both simultaneously. Antony and Cleopatra genuinely needed each other politically. She needed Roman military protection, he needed Egyptian money and resources. But the ancient sources, even the hostile Roman ones, consistently describe something between them that goes beyond political calculation. The 3 days Antony sat motionless at the prow of that ship after Actium was not the behavior of a man whose political alliance had failed. That was the behavior of a man whose heart had broken at exactly the same moment his world collapsed. History has never been kind to either of them. Roman tradition, which shaped how the ancient world was remembered, had every reason to portray Antony as a man destroyed by Eastern decadence and a foreign woman's manipulation. Cleopatra became the archetypal dangerous seductress in Western imagination, a portrait that conveniently erased her genuine intelligence, her administrative ability, her linguistic brilliance, and the fact that she was fighting for the survival of her civilization against the most powerful military machine on Earth. She was not a temptress. She was a queen using every tool available to her in an impossible situation. The tools she had were her mind, her wealth, and the ability to make extraordinary men feel that she was worth everything. She was right. It just was not enough. 2,000 years after their deaths, Mark Antony and Cleopatra are still being made into films, plays, operas, novels, and television series. No other couple from the ancient world comes close to their cultural presence. And the reason is not the romance, though the romance is genuinely extraordinary. The reason is the stakes. These were not ordinary people living ordinary lives who happened to fall in love. These were two of the most powerful individuals alive in the most consequential moment in Western history, and their love for each other directly determined what the world would become. They lost. The world they might have built together, Eastern, multicultural, combining the best of Greek, Egyptian, and Roman civilization, died with them. What we got instead was Rome. And Rome became everything. Because two people loved each other too much to be careful.